It is such a delight to be here in Maastricht again. It's been at least, I think, 8 or 10 years since last time. And I had forgotten what a charming and beautiful city this was. I have 2 daughters who are of an age where if they knew just how great the shopping and restaurant life was in this town, they'd be very jealous that I didn't bring them along. Also thanks to the Green Office, the whole team of you that invited me here today. And thank you for coming and being willing to participate and think and listen and talk with each other, because there'll be a lot of that, especially in the afternoon if you're sticking around for that session, about sustainable development, a topic that is not only important to me, but important to all 7.6 or 7 billion of us here on planet Earth, and getting increasingly so. My plan for this talk is to give you a kind of an overview of what's kind of happening in sustainable development with an eye towards supporting Maastricht University's own commitments and actions on sustainable development. Of course, I probably need to introduce myself to you a little bit. I have for actually more than 30 years now, I guess my bio never got updated, been working on sustainable development, first as an editor in a journal and then as a consultant and an organization leader in many different contexts. As a consultant, one tends to have this as a slide where you show people the various logos of the companies and organizations you've worked with in order to be impressive. For me, this slide has a particularly interesting and personal meaning today because for 25 years I've been running a company called AtKisson Group with a network of people around the world who participate in that organization's university centers like the Green Office are members of that network. It's a kind of a hybrid social enterprise that sometimes acts as a training or professional development group and sometimes as a consultant. And then we've worked with everybody from the United Nations Secretariat to people working in villages in Tanzania, helping them do new strategies and thinking about what to do to put the concept of sustainability into practice. However, this is my very last keynote speech after doing hundreds of speeches around the world on this topic, and my last workshop of this kind. As of Monday, I assume a new position in the Swedish government International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, as the Director of Partnership and Innovation there. So I'm actually in the process of closing down my company and handing off projects to other people in the network to run under a new name, the Sustainability Accelerator Network. And so by pure coincidence, happy coincidence, this event with you marks a kind of a milestone for me. So I will try to avoid getting too nostalgic during the course of my talk, but if you hear a bit of that as it goes forward, then you'll have at least some explanation. I do like to, in general, bring a kind of historical perspective when we're working on sustainable development. Those of us who have been working on it a long time, I think it's good for us to remember how far we've come. Those of us who are newer to the movement, I think it's good to be reminded of the roots of how you got here and what's been happening to get you here in previous decades. This is a movement with a long history that, of course, has recently had a rather climactic moment in its life, and we'll get to that. So my firm also has done other creative things that I just wanted to note that we're not just consultants, we also are people who bring lots of garbage into universities. No, what we did was sponsor and crowdfund an exhibition in Stockholm on the problem of plastic in the ocean last year. And so we got support from all around the world, literally, and then Swedish government support as well, to raise awareness on that particular issue with a exhibit called Out to Sea. So we do a lot of what you might call pro bono work, or have done. We did that because in the course of thinking about sustainable development, we've learned a lot over the course of decades, and this particular issue of the oceans is as important as climate change. When we think of sustainable development, we often tend to simplify it into climate change. That's not correct for a lot of reasons. That's particularly not correct in the case of the ocean. I say ocean is the new climate because the combination of stresses on the ocean and ocean life, plastic pollution in the ocean, like CO2 pollution in the atmosphere, is accumulating and potentially leading us in rather catastrophic directions. So I unfortunately feel I need to keep raising the alarm about that issue so that more and more people get involved. There are quite a lot of interesting NGOs here in the Netherlands who are working on that topic as well. So that's just a little bit about where we are. I've had a really interesting ride as a consultant in the sustainable development field, which most visibly ends up in moments like this. I was on the President's Science and Technology Advisory Council for the European Commission with a president whose name I hope you still remember, Barroso. Memories are short in politics. Some people don't even remember that he was president of the European Commission already. But that was a lovely experience, but not as important as this one. And this is the image I want to really leave with you about how do people working in sustainable development work. And I'm hoping that you have your own networks. I know you do at Maastricht. And if you don't have a really wonderful network of people, friends, colleagues who are working together on sustainable development, please find one. This was mine, has been mine for 30 years. It's called the Balaton Group. It was founded by Donella and Dennis Meadows, authors of The Limits to Growth. And in that picture are A, a lot of my very dear friends in the field, B, a lot of people whose work you are probably influenced by if you're studying or working with any of these topics. And I won't introduce them by name, but you'll see in this picture people who have been senior officials in the UN, people who are well-known media figures in the environmental movement in Thailand, people who are working to keep alive and promote the concept of sustainable development in Russia, and many other folks. And that group, in addition to being a community of trust where you can bring your thoughts and ideas and the paper that you haven't written yet, the new initiative that you're still on the drawing board, has been the source of a lot of innovation in sustainable development, and a lot of it tied to universities. And this is really where I want to go with this, that universities have been, are, must be a kind of fountain for innovation and transformation in sustainable development, far more than they are now. And that's the challenge I'll be laying on the table at the end of my talk. Why? Well, very simply because we're in a very serious race against time. I'm not sure how many of you have already heard the phrase the Great Acceleration in your studies, or just a handful actually. So I encourage you to learn more about this. So this was a study done first 6 or 8 years ago. I can't remember the exact starting date, maybe 10 already, by an interdisciplinary group of scientists based out of the Stockholm Resilience Center in Stockholm. And what it's tracking is global trends in a variety of resource and economic and social and demographic issues, and obviously environmental issues, over the past 250 years. So for 250 years, we have witnessed a slow accumulation of speed that has suddenly become a fast accumulation of speed. On the left side, we see all the socioeconomic trends, and you'll notice, of course, water use, paper use, fertilizer use, energy use. And the little lines to the right of the graph, that's 1950, and that's the moment when this scientific team determined that there was a kind of remarkable tipping point in the human system where we made the shift from simply being an interesting presence on planet Earth to being the dominating presence on planet Earth, to the point where similar scientific groups now have given our period of history its own name, Anthropocene, replacing the Holocene that we've been living through for the last 10,000 years. The period of time when humans are the dominant impact on global ecosystems, and to the point where it's even been measured that we've dammed up so much water that we've affected the rotation of the Earth by milliseconds, but still measurable amounts because of the physics of it. So now the thing about this is that this is not a bad news graph. This is a neutral assessment of trends. And if you're somebody who loves forests, you're maybe worried about that paper use graph. If you're somebody who loves education, you're probably happy about that paper use graph. As one of my old friends, a guy named Tom Atlee, says, what this information tells us is that the world is going in the following way. Things are getting better and better, and worse, faster and faster. And it's the faster and faster point that I want to kind of underscore, that we're in a process of transformation. And some of those transformations are good, some of them are worrying to scary, and they are in an interlocked systemic relationship with each other. That's called the Great Acceleration. And it was not news that things were changing fast, that we've been analyzing this in scientific teams since the book The Limits to Growth made global headlines back in 1972. Unfortunately, those headlines mostly said things like, scientists create computer model of world trends and discover that the world is doomed. That was the usual headline back in 72. And great debates ensued for decades as people on the pro side of continuing economic growth as usual claims that the model had misunderstood various things. People on this side of the model were saying, well, this is not saying that we're doomed. In fact, what the model was saying and what the book said, but most of the critics never actually bothered to read, their second conclusion was not that we were going to be, and by the way, the first conclusion wasn't that the world was doomed. The first conclusion was that if global trends continued, there would be some sort of limit reached and collapse probably to ensue in the next 100 years. So they weren't saying the world is doomed next week. They're saying we're in a long-term process, and if we don't change course, we'll have big trouble within a century. A rather conservative view looking back in time now, but yet highly controversial at the time. But what was missed was the second conclusion from that talk, from that book, which was that it was possible to change, and that if we changed, we could achieve a more sustainable set of dynamic conditions in the global civilization vis-a-vis natural resources and the environment, including meeting everybody's needs. Now, this is the origin of the sustainable development idea, meeting everybody's needs while living within the boundaries of ecosystems. The studies have been updated a number of times. How many people here have seen or are familiar with the planetary boundaries concept? Good. That's interesting. That made a bit more of an impact here than on the previous question. Planetary boundaries is a kind of an iconic study today where the theoretical idea based on a computer model that there were limits to global ecosystems was translated into data, and those limits were defined by scientific consensus, and some assessment could be made as to whether or not human activities were pushing us over the tolerable limits of global ecosystems in these 9 different dimensions. And it's not a static process, of course. It's changing, and all of those red bits or yellow bits or even green bits are growing out towards the limit or have grown past them already. Only one is actually shrinking back within what they call the safe zone, and that's are the various gases that we release that damage the stratospheric ozone layer. So that graph had an enormous impact on the international community, which you'll see in a minute, but I thought it might be fun for people to learn some of the origin behind it. But before I do that, let me acknowledge that while we're here at an event organized by the Green Office, and I'll say more about that later, sustainable development is not an environmental concept. Sustainable development is not about ecology alone. It's about environmental, economic, and social, and human well-being issues. And these have also been assessed by Kate Raworth, whose book, Donut Economics. Again, raise your hand if you know this book. Great, look at that. The hands keep growing. The closer I get to now in time, the more hands go up. Kate's book, she's been wonderful about how she's promoted it too. She's a great Twitter person. Helped define that, yes, there are boundaries for the ecological limits, but there's also a social floor. Where all human needs need to be met, opportunities need to be provided. And the situation today, according to their analysis, is that we're not meeting all those social needs and we're over the boundary on several ecosystems. So sustainable development means reining in some of the stuff that we're doing now that is destroying ecosystems at the same time that we increase and spread out and make more equal access to the resources that everybody needs on planet Earth. And actually those things are going better than you might expect, at least on the social side. Our trends are in the right direction socially. They're not in the right direction mostly ecologically. But again, I wanted to just remind you, where do ideas like this come from? These studies have been highly influential. I was just talking to a company in Sweden which is about to release the first ever report on its performance based on the planetary boundaries. So this is having impacts in policy and business and certainly in the civil society world. But where do ideas like this come from? Well, of course, the planetary boundaries were published in Nature by a very prestigious group of people led by Johan Rockström, who has been head of the Stockholm Resilience Center for many years, is just about to move to the Potsdam Center in Germany. But that's not where it started. It started here with a bunch of university professors drinking beer. And I thought you should see that picture as a kind of an inspirational moment. I had a very important role in this meeting, and that was that I bought the beer. But otherwise, I'm not an esteemed scientist, so I was just happy to host their dialogue as they discovered that, yes, there is now sufficient scientific certainty and knowledge and awareness, ability to gather data and analyze it, that we could define the limits of these global ecosystems, and it's worth trying. And one of those folks, Tariq Banouri, who went on to become the Director for Sustainable Development at the United Nations, at that time was at Stockholm Environment Institute. And he went back and began a series of seminars. When he moved to the United States, Johan Rockström took that series over. It kept growing, and that became the Planetary Boundary Study. But it's nice to know where these things start. They start with people sitting around chatting in an informal context, often tied to their academic interests. How the world doesn't change, and which I think still very many academics believe to be the case, is I publish my paper, world changes. There are many intervening steps in that process where the information has to be translated and activated and brought into some kind of operational useful, and people have to be convinced that it's a good idea to be thinking about. That all happened with Planetary Boundaries. A whole lot of people working very hard for a long time to help translate that concept into good videos and good meetings and presentations and communications, in addition to the hard science that was underneath it. All right. Here's another moment I wanted to share with you. This is a bit of a nostalgic moment. But at this same meeting of the Balaton group, not the same one I showed you previously, but one that had happened 10 years before that, we were having a meeting to talk about sustainability indicators. Long story, and we were looking at Herman Daly's framework. And here I introduced the word framework to talk about sustainable development. Herman Daly, the famous ecological economist, kind of originator of the concept of the steady state economy, had a framework where it was called Daly's Triangle, where nature is the basis of everything. The economy turns nature into stuff. The economy provides the basis for society, and society provides the basis for people to have happy lives and quality of life and search for meaning and all of that. The problem was that that model didn't work in an intercultural setting, because not everybody thought that individual happiness was the pinnacle of the meaning of life. People from Asia said, no, I mean, the social issues are more important to us. By the way, some of the environmental historians were also reminding us that it's not just that the economy is dependent on nature today. The nature is dependent on the economy. If you have a failing economy in Indonesia, people run into the forest and start harvesting endangered species and cutting trees. You have to have both of them working, or they both fail. So that interdependency was an issue that we took up in this working group in the 1990s, and that led to this. Somebody said, oh, we need a new compass for sustainability. And I don't know what happened in my little brain. Compass, north, east, south, west, nature, economy, society, well-being. Eureka! I ran to the whiteboard, I drew this, and that became a framework for sustainability that's now used in a lot of contexts around the world. Looks like this, the sustainability compass. And that's used, for example, universities use it to frame their sustainability reports and to communicate sustainability, engage people. Schools use it. There's a spin-off nonprofit called Compass Education that has trained hundreds and hundreds of teachers in whole school sustainability skills, training students in empowerment for sustainability, compasseducation.org, using it as a systems thinking tool, which we'll also get to, helping people to keep the different dimensions of sustainability in mind. It's used by companies. This is a holding company for a bunch of outdoor firms based in Sweden that uses it as their management compass for sustainability. And of course, it's being used now with the SDGs as a way of helping to cluster and organize the SDGs, the 17 SDGs, which we'll come to later. Other things that happened along the way after that moment, as people began to grapple with sustainability more systematically, was the need for frameworks that would allow for action planning related to sustainability. The Compass was one of many frameworks, I hasten to add, that was framed around measurement and assessment and taking stock of where we were, introducing, orienting people, giving people a sense of what sustainability meant. Next came a methodology to help them think about how to do sustainability. It's called VISUS. Now, here's a funny thing. It wasn't always called VISUS. You'll notice that vision and goals is down here at the bottom, and that the rest of the word after V is ISIS. It was actually called the ISIS method for a long time. And that started to cause problems in the early part of this decade as another organization seemed to steal that name from us. But since vision and goals had always been part of our process, we solved it by adding the V. But if you go Googling, you'll find a book of mine called the ISIS Agreement and things like that. I was not part of the Islamic State. Just to be very clear, it's one of those sad, funny, but not so funny things, which compared to what else was happening around that word, that little problem in our methodology was nothing, but had to be dealt with nonetheless, and remains a footnote in all of my work for 10 years after that. But the methodology is an open source one. And we'll be using it this afternoon in the workshop, and we'll talk more about that. It also became the basis for other kinds of tools and workshops, like this thing called the Sustainability Pyramid, which is also available free on the internet, where people work through this process of, and I'll back up, starting with your vision or your goal for sustainability, gathering information about the trends that are happening, doing some systemic analysis around why those trends are happening and how they're hooked up in cause and effect relationships and feedback loops. Out of that, identifying the leverage points for change where you can make innovation. And then once you've chosen the most strategic, systemic, interesting, I used to say beautiful innovations that fit into that framework, then you strategize for implementation and take it out into the world. That's the VSIS method in a nutshell, and a lot of other planning methods skip that systemic planning part or the deep engagement with innovation that's required. A lot of governments, businesses identify a problem, go straight to some strategy that someone's provided them off the shelf, rather than taking the time to really analyze their system. So we've had a lot of fun, all of my colleagues around the world, and are still having fun running these workshops called Pyramid, where people actually build these pyramids layer by layer, sometimes even resulting in this particular pyramid actually resulted in a change in the law in Latvia on land use planning issues to be more sustainable in a variety of ways. And then lastly, and if you have seen my TED Talk, or TEDx talk, then you'll have seen this already, the amoeba, which is a model for once you've figured out what to do, you need to figure out how to do it and how to implement it. And this was a model based on Everett Rogers' theory of innovation diffusion theory from years ago. A theory, how many people have ever heard of Everett Rogers and innovation diffusion theory in this room? Wow, one person. It's one of the ironies of innovation diffusion theory is that it didn't diffuse very far outside of a very small field of marketers know this. Marketers know innovation diffusion theory very well, and people studying sustainability transition certainly know it, and they've built on it to get much more sophisticated about these thoughts over the year. I built a model called Amoeba on it to help people understand the role of what it means to be a change agent for sustainability, and all the different kinds of help and hindrance and braking effects and obstacles and dynamics that can come up in any social situation where you're trying to introduce an innovation, particularly a sustainability-related innovation. And we have a role-playing game that's attached to that that's been translated into a lot of languages, and people try to introduce innovations in a group, and people fight them, and they have to make alliances, and things either succeed or they fail, and then you have a wonderful debrief about why did your idea succeed or fail, and what do you need to learn about that to help you be a better introducer and leader of change when you go out into the world. So, all of that was studied and recently published in an academic paper, I'm happy to say, led by a former colleague of mine, former assistant, who's now an academic in her own right at Charles University, Dana Kapitulchinova. And we studied our own tools, but more important for you, we studied what everybody was doing. We did a broad literature review of what universities were doing to advance sustainability and sustainable development. And we came to a few conclusions that I'll share with you. There were so many, and by the way, we had to create a new acronym because this was so complicated. Tools, methods, frameworks, models, and approaches. TMFAs. So things like my compass, but there are lots of others, like many others. And at the university context, there were so many different models. People had invented them. Universities have a kind of often an allergic reaction to anything that wasn't invented there. So someone has to invent it there. And then it becomes its own unique model. But they're usually not integrated, or weren't at that stage, into the institution. They were maybe they were helping the recycling program, or they were informing the curriculum development, but there was not an integrated process going on with the use of some framework for sustainable development. And there was no discernible pattern about how these things were matched up. It wasn't like technical universities tended to have this kind of model, and then more social science oriented institutions were going that way. It was really dependent on individuals, either the leaders or the students or faculty with fire in their belly, as we say. and whatever they got passionate about became the framework that the institution used without any serious reflection about what that might mean. Now, that's not a critique of the university world, that's a reflection. And it's a reflection of the whole world, not just universities. That was the situation. Not just in universities, but I would say globally in the world of sustainable development with that kind of chaotic, thrashing about trying to find a framework, which was why I invented mine, which was only one of 1,000, until this moment, when the United Nations, starting in 2012 at Rio with the Rio +20 summit, the document called The Future We Want, had the idea to create what we now call the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is the moment in the negotiating session when the last country had come in with the last word to say, yes, we are also on board. The 193rd country said yes to the Sustainable Development Goals. And here is the co-facilitator of the process, Ambassador Macharia Kamau of Kenya. Yeah! Now, ambassadors don't usually look like they just, scored the winning goal in a football game. That is not normal ambassadorial behavior. This is normal ambassadorial behavior. This was the moment of maybe a few minutes or an hour later when they, formally, welcomed the agreement among all nations, and then launched about 6 weeks later the actual Sustainable Development Goals with these. I'm sure you all know this, right? You've seen these iconic little buttons describing sustainable development. By the way, they were invented by a Swedish graphic designer. Just wanted to be a little nationalistic. And backed up by a long history, which I won't bore you with, but you can get my slides later and remind yourselves about how this all happened. There's that book, Limits to Growth, that I showed you earlier, and several other important key studies coming out of the academic world, out of the institute world, the NGO world, and pushes around the problems getting worse, pulls around more and more people understanding that sustainable development was an opportunity and not just a sort of moral duty, but it actually might even make some money for people and things like that. All those things work together to provide us with this extraordinary moment that the world celebrated in 2015 with the 17 goals, lighting up the whole UN, big names, Daniel Craig coming to the UN, and Shakira singing at the UN, and the Pope speaking at the UN. By the way, that was an interesting moment. Shakira sang Imagine by John Lennon, which includes the words, imagine no religion. And then the Pope is speaking at the UN. So I'd like to just note that the UN truly is a big tent where everybody is welcome and all points of view are considered. But this was a very happy and celebratory moment. So happy, in fact, that I found myself dancing around my kitchen, humming a little melody. Really, if you've been working in sustainable development as long as I had, this moment, the arrival of the Sustainable Development Goals, was magic. This is what we had been not even dreaming about was possible when we started out. I'm saying the group of, I don't know how many thousands of people were actually working on this topic in 1988 and 7 when I was getting started. But it was a pretty small group, and the idea that eventually all world leaders would sign off on something this comprehensive and visionary that included things like halting biodiversity loss, equality for women everywhere. I mean, these are things that were just extraordinarily unheard of as visions at that time. And yet, that's what happened. And so I was dancing around my kitchen. I found myself humming a little melody. Turns out I'm a songwriter, I guess you might know. And I wrote a song about the SDGs. And there's even a music video, so you can find that out later. But that video has been used by the United Nations in meetings as a kind of a coffee break song, and used by schools now. And there's like even a learning sort of a guide to the SDGs through the pop rap song that the students can use to learn about them. And in fact, I was even invited by the European Commission to do first a keynote and then a closing song at a big event in Vienna. So there's the Minister of the Environment for Austria, there's the EU Commissioner for the Environment, and there's me, and I'm singing my song. So I was actually paid with your tax dollars by the European Commission to perform.
Will you sing?
I won't now. Not enough time today, not enough time. What got me singing? What got me singing was that not just the 17 goals themselves, which I won't spend time on, you can read those. What I'll highlight is what is unique and important about the SDGs. And it's just 3 words, and the first one is universal. Just as with the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which in theory and increasingly in practice afforded faith in human rights, shall we say, the belief in the individual value of every human being, and we've been working towards that goal ever since. The SDGs are universal. They don't apply just to the developing countries, a word that is out of fashion already. They don't apply just to people who need it. They apply to everybody. They apply to every country, every city, every sector, every school, every university. That's what universal means. And your head of state signed up to that, in case you didn't know it, whatever country you come from. With a couple of exceptions whose representatives I don't know if they're in the room, but they're universal. The second is they're integrated. Now again, if you are someone like me, and I expect someone like you, and systems thinking is important to you, having an integrated viewpoint is important to you, then the fact that the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda drive, require, push, frame sustainable development in those kinds of integrated terms should also be important to you. It's creating all kinds of change in the world. It's causing ministries to get reorganized. It's causing budgets to get reframed. It's a huge thing that integration has come in to the sustainable development world. And sustainable development got an upgrade. When countries met at the UN to talk about sustainable development prior to 2015, it was only environment ministers. I say only, they were doing really important and difficult work. But after that, it became prime ministers. It became, and their offices and presidents, every 4 years, a summit meeting. And sustainable development started moving out of the environment ministries and into the finance ministries, planning ministries, prime minister's office for overall integrated coordination. Huge change in our world is happening as a result. And finally, it's huge change, the word transformative. That it's built into the title of the document, Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Transformation is all over that documentation. And to the point where I remember as one of my consulting gigs, helping the German government, editing some documents that were designed to inform certain institutional figures who are responsible for making grants on things like climate change, how to tell the difference between incremental change and transformative change. Because suddenly you actually have to have bureaucratic guidelines for that, since you've gotten an instruction that you should be directing this money towards transformative change, not merely incremental, small change. This is wonderful, that transformation has become, you might say, global policy. But what does that mean? What is transformation? In one of my older books from about 10 years ago, the one that used to be called the ISIS Agreement and became retitled the Sustainability Transformation, I tried to simplify it like this. The problems we're dealing with are growing exponentially in the way that I showed you in the Great Acceleration graph and the way that was already known with limits to growth back in 1972. And those problems, challenges, can't keep growing forever. They will eventually collapse because systems can't tolerate that kind of continuous abuse until they start collapsing, as we know from ecosystem and biology and everything else. Eventually, fossil fuel use would drop simply because we'd either run out of the fossil fuels or we'd have too much conflict or we'd be choking in our own global warming. But it's better if we choose it away rather than wait for a collapse to take it away. The drop will happen anyway. And it will happen because this other exponential growth curve is happening at the same time, where the good stuff is also growing very rapidly, but with a delay behind the growth of the problems. So I like to say that what I'm expecting is that sometime when I'm quite old, should I be so lucky to live that long, I'll be able to look back and say, there was this kind of moment, not an exact moment, where we can say the transformation had occurred and we had moved to a sustainable society. Goals are being set for that. In Sweden, we have goals around being fossil fuel free by 2050, for example. We'll be able to look back and say we made a tremendous transition. In the same way that we look back and we see the Berlin Wall fell down. The Berlin Wall was not the moment when the world changed. It was a moment, a punctuation mark in a long paragraph of transformation. It's the moment we remember, but it was a lot of process that happened before and after. Same with apartheid's end in South Africa, for example. So that's a metaphorical idea of transformation. And is it happening? Yes, it's happening. Take a look, for example, at this graph. This is the amount of the world's carbon emissions that are covered by some kind of market pricing mechanism, a tax or an offset system. As of last year, we were up to 25% of the world's carbon emissions, from having been almost nothing as recently as 10 years ago, and that's the secret of exponential growth. It looks like nothing until it starts to really take off. I would predict that within a decade or two, 70 to 80% of global carbon emissions will be covered this way. Or take a look at this graph. This is the growth in what's called green bonds or sustainability badged financial obligations and instruments. And that's also been growing dramatically. In 2017, it reached 155 billion US dollars. The estimates are coming in for 2018 already, and they're off the chart. Actually, you can't see this, but it'll be up here. 250 to 300 billion US dollars. A transformation happening in the global financial industry as people begin to redirect pension fund monies and all kinds of other things into sustainable development. Or check these graphs out on renewable energy, one of the most familiar but still remarkable things to think about. Where we were 10 years ago compared to where we are now, where we're witnessing transformation in progress. That's, for me, a very exciting thing to be living through and to be participating in. So it's not happening everywhere, like the design community was still not really getting a lot of sustainable development. So working with the Norwegian Center for Design and Architecture, we did a thing over the last few years where we took this is their conference series called Framtanker, which means forward thinking in Norwegian. It's actually a made-up word even in Norwegian, but it's a beautiful word. They work with skiing companies and outdoor clothing, and we had a moment where we said, in a panel discussion, you'll have panel discussions here. We said, well, could we take the SDGs and turn them into a design brief for designers? Like designers get design briefs, make me stuff and make it this way. So we did that. We turned it into a document called the Oslo Manifesto, and people started signing it, and it's spreading, and even a whole companies are getting started. There's a new web platform that's inspiring people with ideas for design that matches the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. This guy started a new company trying to make the most sustainable outdoor clothing ever. So transformation's happening. I wanted to show you what's happening outside your world of the university and also what's happening in it. Outside, companies are beginning to see that the Sustainable Development Goals are a huge opportunity, and it's been estimated in the trillions of dollars or euros or your preferred currency in terms of just taking the innovations that are already on the table, that are already implemented in small scale and scaling them up in agriculture, for example, manufacturing, the circular economy. These are all proof of, these concepts are proven, and so they can be scaled up and people can essentially clean up economically from them, and that's happening. Increasingly around the world. Or what's happening with the frameworks that businesses use to guide them. They used to just use the global reporting initiatives, three-legged stool for sustainability, trying to limit their negative impacts on the world. Now they've got a net positive project. Our impact should be not just less negative, but actually positive, restoration of the climate system rather than reducing the negative impact, for example. So they've adopted an idea actually invented by an old friend of mine in India, but he never gets credit for it. There's the negative footprint, but there's the positive handprint as well, where you're actively improving the lives of your workers and you're actively resetting ecosystems that have been destroyed, for example. Or even tougher is this thing called the Future Fit Business Network, which sets even harder goals for sustainability and accountability mechanisms. So businesses are there. And I ask you, have you seen any universities be there yet? Where as institutions, they've set net positive goals or really at an integrated level try to drive change to their systems. And I would submit that I know very few that are at that level yet. In the university world, we have the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is helping some universities have just barely gotten started with this work. You're not there, obviously, but that's where a lot of people are. Germany has a sustainability code that they've applied now, are beginning to develop. It's worked in business. They're applying it now to the university sector. The EU has an initiative, and you'll get these slides, and you can Google all this information up later if it's of interest to you. And there's something new called the SDG Accord. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of the SDG Accord. Wow, 2 people. So this is a globally growing movement of universities who are signing a commitment to say we really support the SDGs and we're going to do stuff about that publicly. It's got a lot of wonderful language about the SDGs and collaboration. It's very similar to what your university has already taken forward in its vision for 2030. So there's an easy win that I recommend to you, and I'll say more about that as well. I wanted to also just say a few words about my favorite case study. These are friends of mine at the University of Calgary in Canada. And if you know anything about where Calgary is, and it's sort of like, it's in Alberta, which is something like the Texas of Canada. Lots of oil and gas, the tar sands are there. But this university also won the award for the most active university on the Sustainable Development Goals. They have a remarkable program that has engaged students and faculty and operations. They've reduced their carbon emissions by 25–30% in just a few years. They have new regulations about the buildings that are being produced. They have an embedded certificate in sustainable development for undergraduates. So all undergraduates can take 4 interdisciplinary courses on sustainable development, get that added to their degree. Not all of them can do it yet because it's only in a certain number of spaces available, but it's got a line out the door of students that want to get this additional credit on their degree because it's valuable in the workplace. That's how they market it, not because they're going to save the world, but because this is where the world is going and you need that credential to be able to interact with the businesses and organizations that you'll be working in. So check out what the University of Calgary is doing if you need a benchmark, and there are lots of them for where the bar has been raised now and what's expected in the university context to really excel in the field of sustainable development. So, you've seen these before. So I wanted to share with you a modest proposal and I'll close. So universities are already perceived as leaders in sustainable development. That's true, and of course I've shown you now examples of some of the key concepts like the planetary boundaries that grew out of university-based research and affected international negotiation and corporate business strategy and all the rest of it. Planetary boundaries was all the talk of World Economic Forum a few years ago, for example. However, universities are still really not visibly leading on this topic, I would say. Not in the way that I think they should be, given the important role that they play. And I would propose that even participants at this event could start a dialogue and begin to assess options for how to raise the bar even higher here at Maastricht, which has a historical sort of placement in the heart of Europe and which has already made public declarations of intent. So you could endorse the SDG Accord, for example, as a university and make some press release noise about that to begin to raise visibility here in the region and in your home city. You could develop some new statement, initiative, campaign that raises the bar and visibility on sustainable development within the university and outside of its walls. And you don't have to look very far to do that. I had forwarded to me by the organizers here a beautiful document, difficult to read, but beautiful nonetheless, about the Sustainability 2030 plan for Maastricht University. And buried in that document was a statement like this: integrating sustainability in the veins of the organization, and then stimulating people in the community to take sustainability into account in all decision making. And that's buried on page 4, bullet point 6 or something, and it should be a headline somewhere. This is where the university is going. And you might want to even consider, I'm sorry because it might cost you the cost of new roll-ups, changing the name of an office like Green Office, which is, as I've noted, kind of an old way of talking about sustainable development, to the Office of Sustainability or some other similarly more comprehensive way of thinking about the modern framing of sustainability. So with that, I want to thank you for giving me your attention. I want to just open the floor for any comments and questions and see where we go. And actually, before we open the floor, let me suggest you do this. Even though you're spread out a little bit, you're close enough to other people. Take 2 minutes and just chat with somebody next to you. Like, wow, that was not what I was expecting to hear, or that raises a question, or he's really off base with that particular fact, or I wonder. Share your own reflections with each other in groups of 2 or 3 for 2 minutes, and then I'll ask for your questions. Please, start. Could I hear what you're thinking? Somebody must have a reflection or a comment, or if you aren't thinking anything, maybe you heard somebody else say something interesting or frame a question that you think is worth asking. Yeah.
Hi, how you going? Thank you for that. That was brilliant, and really interesting seeing that university perspective towards the end as well. So, big question I have. So, having been in lots of different universities, and you see that commitment at the top level to the Sustainable Development Goals. But then often what I've been involved in is this sort of tick box exercise where everyone says how what they're already doing contributes to this, and you don't see any actual change in what's going on. It just provides a new language for talking about what's already happening. So how do you move from the tick box exercise to actually doing something that's transformative?
Yeah. I'm going to, of course, be biased and say that I think you need good tools and processes. And tick box exercises are a tool and a process, and they're often useful. Are we doing this, yes or no? But they don't drive interdisciplinarity. They don't drive collaborative thinking. They don't drive innovative processes. So they are what they are. They're useful assessment exercises. So what you need is processes that are in fact designed to drive interdisciplinary, collaborative, transformative, innovative thinking. That's what we used Pyramid for example. The University of Calgary example that I brought up, one of the things they did was they ran 8 different pyramid exercises with 8 different pieces of the university infrastructure. People doing faculty, students, operations, et cetera. And they brought interdisciplinary groups around that. And with a good process, and it doesn't have to be that one, but any good process where you're leading people through a process where you say the goal of our process now is to have new ideas, people usually respond with new ideas. They have to be invited and facilitated or given an opportunity to do that. And then those ideas also have to have a process for how they are moved through a kind of vetting or feasibility assessment into actual action. And of course, there are a lot of hindrances along the way, and particularly in the university world where everybody is trained to be everybody else's critic. And that's not a criticism of the university. That's just a reflection of the culture that it's designed around. And that means that you have to allow extra time and extra inclusion for some kind of consensus to emerge, or you have to have strong leadership, like say Arizona State University in the US, Cameron Crowe, he's a strong leader, but he gets people behind his leadership. Or you need to allow freedom for experimentation. Like, okay, we don't all agree with you, person X in your department, but we'll let you try that. And if it works, then we'll consider spreading it elsewhere. So those are some approaches to that. But you need, when you have a criticism that's just a tick box exercise, I would recommend saying it's just not saying that, and saying instead, well, that's a useful exercise and we should be doing or could be doing this and this and this, which is designed to help us go farther. Good question, thank you.
As a student in the university context, and also here in Maastricht, there are a lot of student-driven initiatives that drive forward like sustainability efforts. But in the transformation, in the transition of this organization, how much would you say is this, is like a student, how much should students be involved? How much should this also be perhaps then like a main priority for professionals, like for actually hiring people, making this core kind of strategy of the university, and how much can it be? What interplay kind of is?
The answer to your question was embedded in your question itself. For example, embedding knowledge of and attitudes towards sustainable development in interview questions for new jobs. Are you aware of the SDGs? What's your feeling about them? And if they're not aware at all, but they seem open, that's a plus. And if they say, well, sustainable development, you might reconsider whether that's the right person for that job, given what we're up against in time. In general, in all institutions, and educational institutions are no exception, but they have a special kind of structure to them, what you need and want is everybody on board. So that Compass Education NGO that I mentioned, they work with schools, K-12 schools, primary and secondary schools. And they train the teachers, they train the board members, they train the students, and try to get everybody on board and sort of going in the same way. Harder at the university level for the reasons I discussed and that we just discussed. But you do want that. And then if you can't get that, and I've seen this in city governments and all kinds of things, then you take what you can get. And if the only group that's really on fire about sustainable development is the students, then you just let them run as hard as possible, and they need to charge themselves up and not worry about the fact that they're bouncing off brick walls once in a while. Just keep going. Other times I've seen, say, middle management, where there's top management that's kind of in the way or not supportive, but the middle managers are trying to make things happen. And in that case, you just need smart tactics. I remember a city in the United States where the head of the city government apparatus was saying sustainability is a left green word and we're not going to use it. So the middle management that was trying to make sustainability happen got clever, and they started talking about saving money and improving morale and raising team spirit and getting more public positive attention. And within a year and a half, that same person was accepting an award for the city as the most sustainable one in that region, and he had changed his tune on the value of the word sustainable. Yeah? So clever strategy of that kind can help make the best use of the commitment that you do have from whatever constituency is on board with this agenda. But you really want everybody on board. In the university setting, folks at the top have other agendas. They're trying to make sure the whole system is just working. And they can't often, not every university president or chancellor can become that firebrand. But if you can get the people around them to at least bless or create safe conditions for the experimentation and initiative of other people, saying, oh yeah, that looks good, keep doing that. That's enough usually. Good question. I think Maastricht can do a whole lot more. I was impressed by what I saw on paper. I've been hearing a little bit about what's been going on here. But it's clear that given the role and identity and the reputation for being an innovative center of learning, and all of those things can be built on to bring sustainable development more into the heart, and can be legitimated by the combination of looking to other institutions that are doing that to say, well, if they're doing it, we can do it. And also looking at those institutions and say, well, look at that, they're speeding past us, so we need to race to catch up to be at the forefront that we say we want to be at. And I'll close the answer to that little response with just a remembrance of one of my clients, which in this case a corporate client, and they had been used to being the leaders for 10 years on what was then called corporate social responsibility. And then we did an assessment. And we discovered, among other things, that they were ranked, at the bottom on climate change, and they were good on some of these social issues, but very bad on other things. And they got that feedback, and they started working. And 10 years later, they're considered one of the leading companies on the whole range of sustainability issues now, in an integrated way. It took them 5 to 10 years of steady transformational work, but that's what that kind of work takes, and it can be done. So in an institution like this, that's possible. Yes.
Going back to this example of Calgary,
Yeah.
because the university is placed in a city like we are and less complex and needs other organizations. How does expand in Calgary as the university is so active in this field? How does this influence the city?
That's a good question, and I can't say that I can answer it well. I would say that if you're interested, you could get in touch with them, and I would be happy to provide you with a name or two, and you could ask them what they say. As all town and gown relationships, as they're called in the British context, I don't know if you know that phrase here, relationships between the city and the institution have some tensions around them, and they go up and down depending on what's happening. And I've seen my own experience in Calgary, because I've been there to work with the region as a consultant in the past as well, has been, when the politics in the region change, their attitudes towards sustainability change. One thing about a university in relationship to a region is that its politics change much more slowly. And once you're on course, you tend to stay on that course. So you can become a kind of a stable place where sustainable development is happening no matter what's happening in the politics around you. In Calgary, they absolutely have had, to get to your point, a lot of interaction and a lot of impact, a lot of innovation from the university flowing out into startups and entrepreneurship and people winning awards for different kinds of things they've developed and getting attention for that in the local press. Absolutely. But I would dare not assess overall. So please let me know if you want to find out more detail. Anybody else? We have to wrap this up, don't we?
And maybe, as you said, that you work so long in the field, and I think you were already mentioning some of the changes, but what, for you, maybe also in your work as a consultant and as trying to help other institutions to make this transformation, what do you have perceived as having changed the most in how you can help these institutions, but maybe have their needs changed in what they...
Wow, what a lovely question. Thank you. Things have changed dramatically. Yeah? For the 1990s, the task was just introduction of concept and measurement. For the 2000s, it was the beginning of actually interacting with them in a strategic way. Okay, now we have some data that says that we have high emissions, or that our city has a problem with inequality. What should we be doing? So then we began intervening in a strategic context. And now, the 2000 teens, shall we say, the important shift has been that shift into money, where investment, financial planning, and just the general understanding that a transition to sustainable development is not just about, it is about changing behavior, and it is about having different goals, but it's also about changing the direction of our investments so that we're actually as the old American expression, putting our money where our mouth is. And that's something that I've seen change a lot as banks, investment funds, pension funds, budget allocations in governments are increasingly taking sustainability into account, either as a goal or as a filtering mechanism. We did a study for the WWF a few years ago, one of our client studies. We looked at the entire global financial system, trying to help them look for where their leverage points for change were as an NGO. Where should they be focusing their attention? And we found 106 leverage points in the global financial system where change was happening around sustainable development. And we found that where it was happening in more advanced ways was not where you would expect. It was often not in Europe, for example. I would guess that hardly anybody here knows, because I certainly didn't know, that the most advanced banking laws on things like energy are in China, where to get a commercial loan of any size, you have to go to the bank not just with your financial statement, but also with your plan for the energy efficiency and renewable energy investments you're going to make as part of that building or business development. Now, I don't know, because I'm not there and I've never looked at this carefully, to what extent that's actually followed and implemented, but I know it's in the law, and it's a requirement, and it's not a requirement anywhere that I know of in Europe, as an example. So California just required new solar panels on all new buildings that are built there. So those requirements for different kinds of investment is where the leverage points have changed. And so the advisory work now consists of trying to advise those decisions. If you want to be at the cutting edge, it's how do we change where we're putting the resources, not just where we're putting intention. Great question, thank you. I guess that's it. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I hope you go forth and really make tremendous transformative change here in Maastricht.